In a small village nestled between gentle hills, where the land rolled softly, like waves frozen in time, the morning of Easter arrived as it always did, with the softest light imaginable, pale and golden, spreading slowly across whitewashed walls and cobblestone paths that were still cool from the long night that had just passed. The light came first to the highest points, touching the weather vane atop the old stone church, then sliding down the slate roofs, then finding the upper windows of the cottages that lined the narrow lanes, and finally, as the sun lifted itself above the distant hills, it reached the ground itself, warming the stones one by one, patient and unhurried in its arrival. The village had stood in this place for generations beyond counting, and it had a quality of permanence about it, as though it had grown from the earth itself rather than being built upon it. The cottages were made of local stone, their walls thick and solid, their roofs thatched with reeds from the marshes that lay beyond the eastern hills. The lanes that wound between them followed ancient paths that had been walked so many times over so many years that they had worn themselves into the landscape, becoming part of the natural order of things. In the early morning, before the village truly woke, there was a particular stillness that hung over everything, a quietness so complete that it seemed to have weight and substance. It was not the silence of absence, but rather the silence of presence, of the world holding itself in a state of perfect balance, waiting for the day to begin. The air was cool and clear, with that crystalline quality that comes only in spring, when the winter has fully released its hold, but the warmth of summer has not yet arrived. A woman woke in one of these cottages, a small dwelling with thick walls and a thatched roof, a place she had lived for many years, long enough that she knew the sound of every floorboard, the way the morning light entered through each window at different hours, the particular scent of the air in each season. She woke before the bells began to ring, as she often did, her eyes opening slowly to the dim interior of her bedroom, where the furniture stood in familiar shadows, and the air held the coolness of the night. She lay still for a moment, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of the quilts over her, the softness of the pillow beneath her head, and she breathed slowly, deeply, letting herself come fully awake in her own time. The room around her was simple and unadorned, containing only what was necessary and nothing more. A wooden wardrobe stood against one wall, its doors carved with a simple pattern of vines and leaves, worn smooth by the touch of many hands over many years. A small table sat beside the bed, holding a candlestick and a few other small objects, and on the wall above it hung a mirror with a wooden frame, its surface spotted with age. The floor was bare wood, covered in places by small woven rugs that had been made by hands long since stilled. She could hear, very faintly, the first sounds of morning, beginning outside, sounds so quiet that they were almost not sounds at all, more like the suggestion of sound, the idea of it. A bird somewhere, calling once, and then falling silent. The creak of a branch moving in a breeze she could not yet feel. The distant, almost inaudible murmur of the stream that ran along the edge of the village, constant and unchanging. These sounds were so familiar to her that she barely registered them consciously, yet she would have noticed immediately if they had been absent, would have felt the wrongness of their absence. When she rose, she moved quietly, her bare feet touching the smooth wooden floor, cool against her skin, and she walked to the window. drawing back the simple curtain to look out at the village beyond. The curtain was made of plain linen, unbleached and undyed, and it moved easily on its wooden rod, making only the softest whisper of sound. The window itself was small, with thick glass that was slightly uneven, so that the view through it was subtly distorted, wavering slightly, as though she were looking at the world through water. The sky was shifting from gray to the palest blue, a transformation so gradual that it seemed to be happening, and not happening at the same time, and she watched it for a while, her hands resting on the window-sill, feeling the slight chill of the morning air that came through the gap where the window did not quite meet the frame. The air smelled fresh and clean, carrying with it the scent of grass and earth and the faint sweetness of early spring flowers, and she breathed it in deeply, filling her lungs with it, feeling it wake something in her, a quiet appreciation for the simple fact of being alive, of being here, in this moment. Outside, the village was still, no movement in the lanes, no smoke yet rising from chimneys, only the quiet that comes before the day truly begins. She could see the lane that ran past her cottage, the cobblestones pale in the growing light, and beyond it the cottage opposite, its windows still dark, its door closed. A cat sat on the window-sill of that cottage, a gray cat with white paws, and it was washing itself with careful deliberation, one paw raised, tongue moving methodically over the fur. The cat paused in its washing and looked toward her window, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance, a moment of connection, and then the cat returned to its task, and she smiled slightly, turning away from the window. She turned from the window and dressed slowly, pulling on simple clothes, a long skirt, and a soft blouse, a shawl that she wrapped around her shoulders against the morning coolness. She moved through the small cottage, her footsteps barely making a sound, and she went to the hearth, where embers from the previous evening still glowed faintly beneath the ash. She knelt and stirred them gently with an iron poker, adding a few small pieces of kindling, watching as the flames began to catch, small and hesitant at first, then growing steadier, casting a warm light across the stone floor. She did not hurry. There was no need to hurry. Once the fire was burning well enough, she stood and went to the table, a sturdy wooden table that had been in the cottage longer than she had, its surface worn smooth by years of use. She set out a simple cloth, white and carefully folded, smoothing it with her hands until it lay flat and even. Then she lit a single candle, placing it in a brass holder at the center of the table, and the flame rose straight and still in the quiet air. The light from the candle was soft, golden, and it made the room feel peaceful, as though the day itself was beginning with a gentle blessing. She went to the small kitchen at the back of the cottage, where shelves held simple crockery and jars of dried herbs, and she filled a kettle with water from a clay pitcher, then carried it back to the hearth and hung it on a hook above the flames. She watched the fire for a moment, the way the flames moved and curled, the soft crackling sound they made, and then she returned to the window, looking out again at the village as the light continued to grow, spreading across the rooftops, illuminating the edges of things, making shadows that were long and soft. The water in the kettle began to warm, and she waited, standing by the hearth, her hands folded loosely in front of her, listening to the faint sounds of the morning. Somewhere in the distance a bird called, a single clear note that hung in the air and then faded. Another bird answered, and then another, and gradually the morning chorus began, soft and scattered, not yet full or insistent, just the tentative greetings of creatures waking to the day. She listened, and she felt the same quiet waking happening within herself, a slow gathering of energy, a gentle readiness. When the water began to simmer, she took the kettle from the fire and poured it into a small teapot, adding a pinch of dried leaves from one of the jars, leaves she had gathered and dried herself the previous summer. The steam rose from the spout in delicate spirals, carrying with it the faint scent of chamomile and mint, and she set the pot on the table beside the candle, covering it with a knitted posy to let it steep. Then she sat in one of the wooden chairs, her hands resting on the table, and she waited, watching the candlelight, feeling the warmth of the fire at her back, content to be still. Through the window she could see the sky growing lighter, the blue deepening, becoming more certain, and she watched as the first rays of direct sunlight touched the upper windows of the houses across the lane, turning the glass to gold. The village was beginning to wake, though it did so slowly, without haste. A door opened somewhere, and she heard the soft murmur of a voice, though she could not make out the words. A shutter creaked. A cat appeared in the lane, padding silently along the cobblestones, pausing to sniff at a doorstep before continuing on its way. The morning light had a particular quality to it, something that she had noticed over the years but could never quite put into words. It was softer than the light of midday, more forgiving, and it seemed to touch everything with a kind of gentleness, smoothing over rough edges, making even the most ordinary things seem somehow special. The cobblestones in the lane, worn and uneven, became a pattern of light and shadow. The whitewashed walls of the cottages glowed as though lit from within. Even the dust motes that floated in the air near the window seemed to dance with a delicate grace. She watched a sparrow land on the sill outside her window, a small brown bird with bright eyes, and it hopped along the wood, pecking at something invisible, its movements quick and efficient. She remained very still, not wanting to startle it, and for a moment she and the bird existed in the same space, separated only by the thin glass of the window. Then the bird took flight, a blur of brown wings, and was gone, leaving behind only the memory of its presence. She poured herself a cup of tea, the liquid pale and fragrant, and she held the cup in both hands, feeling its warmth, letting the steam rise to her face. The cup was old, one of a set that had belonged to her mother, plain white porcelain, with a delicate blue pattern around the rim, faded now from years of washing. She had drunk from this cup countless times, and each time she held it, she felt a connection not just to her mother, but to all the mornings that had come before, all the quiet moments of sitting at a table with a cup of tea, watching the day begin. She sipped slowly, tasting the delicate flavor, and she felt the warmth spread through her, gentle and soothing. The tea had a subtle taste, not strong or assertive, but quiet and comforting, with notes of chamomile and mint, and something else she could never quite identify, something that might have been the taste of summer itself, of long afternoons and gentle breezes. She drank it in small sips, letting each mouthful rest on her tongue before swallowing, giving herself fully to the simple pleasure of it. As she sat, she became aware of the sounds of the cottage around her, sounds she normally did not notice, because they were so constant, so much a part of the background of her life. The settling of the wooden beams overhead, making soft creaking sounds, as they adjusted to the changing temperature. The tick of the old clock on the mantel, though it no longer kept accurate time, its mechanism worn and unreliable. The whisper of the fire in the hearth, the soft movement of air up the chimney, all of these sounds wove together into a kind of music, a quiet symphony that played constantly, unheard, and yet always present. She sat like this for a long time, drinking her tea in small sips, watching the morning unfold outside her window, feeling no need to do anything more than be present in this moment, in this quiet beginning to the day. There was something deeply peaceful about these morning hours, about the way the world seemed to hold its breath before fully committing to the business of being awake. It was a time that belonged neither to night nor to day, but to something in between, a liminal space where anything seemed possible, and yet nothing was required. The candle on the table burned steadily, its flame unwavering in the still air, and she watched it for a while, fascinated by the way the light seemed to emerge from the darkness at its center, radiating outward in a soft glow. Fire was mysterious, she thought. Even this small domesticated fire, even this gentle candle flame, it consumed and yet gave, destroyed and yet created. And there was something profound in that paradox, something that spoke to the fundamental nature of existence itself. When the tea was finished, she rinsed the cup and the pot, setting them on a shelf to dry, and then she moved through the cottage, tidying small things, straightening a cushion, folding a blanket, her movements slow and methodical. She picked up a book that lay on the chair by the fire, marking the place with a strip of fabric before setting it on the shelf with the other books. She adjusted the position of the candlestick on the mantel, moving it just slightly so that it sat perfectly centered. These were small acts, meaningless perhaps in any larger sense, but they brought her a quiet satisfaction, a sense of order and rightness. She was preparing to go out, though there was no urgency in her preparations. She moved at the pace the morning seemed to ask for, a pace that honored the stillness, the softness of the light, the gentle unfolding of Easter morning. She went to the small basin near the kitchen and washed her hands and face in cool water, the shock of it pleasant and awakening, and she dried herself with a rough linen towel, feeling the texture of the fabric against her skin. She looked around the cottage one more time, making sure everything was in its place, that the fire was safe, that the candle was stable in its holder, that nothing had been forgotten or left undone. This checking was habit, ritual, something she did every time she left the cottage, even if only for a short while. It was a way of taking care, of showing respect for her home and all that it provided, shelter and warmth and a place to belong. She put on her shoes, simple leather shoes, worn soft with age, the leather shaped to her feet, comfortable and familiar, and she took a shawl from a peg by the door, wrapping it around her shoulders. The shawl was made of wool, hand-knitted in a pattern of simple stitches, and it had been with her for many years, a gift from someone whose face she could still picture clearly, though they had been gone for a long time now. She pulled the shawl close, feeling its warmth, feeling the connection to the past that it represented. She stood for a moment at the threshold, looking back into the cottage, at the candle still burning on the table, at the fire settling into steady coals, at the familiar interior that had been her home for so long, and then she opened the door and stepped outside into the morning air. The coolness touched her face immediately, fresh and clean, carrying with it the scent of the countryside, of earth and grass, and the faint sweetness of early flowers. It was a different air than the air inside the cottage, less contained, more alive with movement and possibility. She breathed it in deeply, filling her lungs, feeling it wake every part of her, and she closed the door gently behind her, hearing the soft click of the latch, and stood on the stone step, looking out at the lane, at the cobblestones still shadowed in places, still holding the coolness of the night. The sun was higher now, and the light was spreading, reaching into the narrow spaces between buildings, illuminating the walls, making the whitewash seem to glow with an inner radiance. The shadows cast by the eaves and chimneys were sharp and dark, creating patterns on the ground, geometric shapes that would shift and change as the sun continued its journey across the sky. She noticed these things without thinking about them, simply taking them in, letting them register in some part of her mind that was beyond words. The lane was empty at this early hour, though she could hear sounds coming from inside the cottages she passed. The muffled voices of people beginning their day, the clatter of pots and pans, the scrape of a chair on a floor. These sounds were comforting in their ordinariness, a reminder that she was part of a community, that others were waking and preparing and moving through their own morning rituals, and that all of this was happening simultaneously, 1,000 small acts of living occurring side by side. She began to walk, her footsteps quiet on the stones, moving along the lane that curved gently between the cottages. The cobblestones were smooth from centuries of use, worn down by countless footsteps, by cartwheels and hooves and the simple passage of time. They were uneven in places, some higher than others, some cracked or missing entirely, but she knew them all, knew where to step to avoid the ones that wobbled, knew which sections held water after rain and which ones dried quickly in the sun. The village was built on a slight slope, and the lanes followed the contours of the land, winding in easy curves, never straight, always turning just enough to offer a new view, a different perspective. This was a village that had grown organically over time, not planned or designed, but rather evolved, shaped by the needs of the people who lived here and the constraints of the landscape. The result was a kind of natural harmony, a feeling that everything was exactly where it should be, that nothing could be moved or changed without disrupting the delicate balance of the whole. She knew every turn, every doorway, every window, and yet this morning, as with every morning, the village seemed somehow new, as though the light had changed everything, made everything fresh. The same cottages she had passed 1,000 times before looked different in the Easter morning light, their walls brighter, their windows more reflective, their doors more substantial. It was as though she were seeing them for the first time, noticing details that had always been there but had escaped her attention, the texture of the stone, the pattern of the thatch, the way a vine climbed the wall of one cottage, its new leaves just beginning to unfurl. She passed a cottage where an elderly woman stood in the doorway, wrapped in a heavy shawl despite the growing warmth of the day, and they exchanged a nod, a soft smile, no words needed. The woman's face was deeply lined, marked by years of sun and wind and the simple passage of time, but her eyes were bright and clear, and there was a kindness in them that spoke of a life lived with generosity and grace. They had known each other for years, these two women, had been neighbors and acquaintances, and something more than that, something that did not require definition or naming. The woman watched her go and then turned back into her cottage, closing the door slowly, carefully, as though not wanting to disturb the morning's peace. Further along, a man was drawing water from a well, the rope creaking as he lowered the bucket, and he paused in his work to wish her good morning, his voice low and gentle, and she returned the greeting, her own voice soft, barely more than a murmur. The man was middle-aged, with strong arms and a weathered face, and he moved with the easy efficiency of someone who had performed this task countless times, who knew exactly how much rope to let out, exactly when to begin pulling it back up. The well was old, built of stone, with an iron mechanism that turned with a pleasing regularity, and she could hear the splash of the bucket hitting the water far below, a sound that echoed briefly before being absorbed by the depth. The lane widened as she walked, opening into a small square where several paths met, and in the center of the square stood an ancient oak tree, its branches spreading wide, still bare but with the first tight buds of spring beginning to show. The tree was massive, its trunk so wide that it would take several people with outstretched arms to encircle it, and its bark was deeply furrowed, marked with the scars and signatures of time. It was very old, this tree, older than anyone in the village, older perhaps than the village itself, and it stood as a kind of silent witness to all the mornings that had come before, all the springs, all the Easters, countless and uncounted. Beneath the tree was a stone bench, worn smooth by generations of use, its surface cool and slightly damp from the night air. She paused there for a moment, resting her hand on the back of the bench, feeling the solidness of the stone beneath her palm, and she looked up at the branches against the pale sky. The buds were small and tight, barely visible against the gray wood, but they were there, holding within them the promise of leaves and shade and the fullness of summer. Everything in its time, she thought, everything unfolding at its own pace, according to rhythms that were older and deeper than any human understanding. She could see, carved into the bark of the tree, initials and dates, some fresh and clear, others so old that they had been stretched and distorted by the tree's growth, becoming abstract shapes that only hinted at the letters they had once been. These marks were a kind of history, a record of people who had stood in this spot, who had wanted to leave some evidence of their existence, some proof that they had been here, had loved and hoped and dreamed. She did not add her own mark to the tree, had never felt the need to, but she understood the impulse, the desire to connect with something permanent, something that would outlast the brief span of a human life. She continued on, leaving the square behind, following the lane that led toward the church. The path here was lined with low stone walls, their tops rounded and softened by moss and lichen, and behind the walls were gardens, small plots where villagers grew vegetables and herbs, and here and there flowers. The gardens were just beginning to wake from winter, the soil dark and rich, still moist from recent rains, and she could see the first green shoots pushing up through the earth, tentative and fragile but determined, reaching toward the light. She walked slowly, looking at the gardens as she passed, seeing the early flowers that had begun to bloom, soft whites and tender yellows, their petals still closed or just beginning to open, nodding gently in the cool breeze that moved through the village. There were primroses, their delicate blooms clustered at the base of stone walls, and crocuses, purple and white and yellow, scattered across the grass like fallen stars. There were daffodils, too, their bright heads just beginning to push free of their sheaths, and she felt a small lift of joy at the sight of them, at this evidence of renewal of life returning after the long winter. The air smelled of damp earth and new grass, that particular scent of spring mornings when the ground is still holding moisture from the night, and the plants are breathing out their freshness into the air. It was a clean smell, uncomplicated and pure, and it seemed to speak of beginnings, of possibility, of the world making itself new once again. She breathed deeply, filling her lungs with it, feeling it settle into her, clean and reviving, washing away the staleness of winter, the long months of cold and darkness. The breeze was gentle, just enough to stir her shawl, to lift a strand of hair from her face, and she welcomed it, the coolness of it, the way it carried the scents and sounds of the waking world. It brought with it the smell of wood smoke from chimneys just beginning to produce it, the distant sound of a rooster crowing, the rustle of leaves in the gardens, the whisper of grass moving in wave-like patterns. All of these sensations wove together into a rich tapestry of experience, and she received them all with quiet gratitude, with an appreciation that required no thought or analysis, but simply existed as a kind of open receptivity. She moved slowly, feeling no rush, letting her footsteps fall in rhythm with the morning's calm. Each step was deliberate, measured, her heel touching the cobblestone first, then the rest of her foot, a gentle rolling motion that required no thought, that was as natural as breathing. This walking was meditative, a kind of moving prayer, and she felt connected through it to the earth beneath her feet, to the stones that had been placed here so long ago, to all the feet that had walked this same path before her, generation after generation, moving toward the same destination for the same purpose. She passed more cottages, more gardens, and occasionally she would see someone else, a figure moving in a doorway, a child peering out of a window with sleep-mussed hair and curious eyes, and there would be a moment of connection, a glance, a small wave, and then she would continue on, alone again with the morning. These brief encounters were pleasant, undemanding, requiring nothing more than simple acknowledgment, and she appreciated them for their lightness, for the way they touched her life without weighing it down. A dog trotted past her, going in the opposite direction, a brown and white dog with a friendly face and a wagging tail, and it paused to sniff at her hand when she extended it, its nose wet and cold against her skin. She scratched behind its ears for a moment, feeling the warmth of its body, the softness of its fur, and then it continued on its way, its business apparently more urgent than hers, and she watched it go with a slight smile. Animals had their own lives, their own concerns, and she found something comforting in that, in the knowledge that the world was full of consciousnesses other than human, all going about their own purposes, all part of the great web of existence. The church came into view as she rounded a curve in the lane, and she stopped for a moment to look at it. It was an old stone church, built centuries ago by hands that were long since dust, its walls thick and solid, constructed of large blocks of gray stone that had been quarried from the hills nearby. The stones were weathered now, their surfaces softened by exposure to wind and rain, and they were covered in places with moss and lichen, green and orange and pale gray, creating patterns that were both random and somehow perfect. The roof was steep and covered with dark slate that had weathered to various shades of gray, some tiles almost black, others lighter, some with patches of orange where iron deposits had oxidized over the years. A small tower rose at one end, square and solid, with narrow windows that looked out over the village and the countryside beyond. In the tower were the bells that would soon ring, calling the villagers to gather, bells that had been cast in a foundry long ago and hung here, bells that had marked the hours and the days and the years, that had rung for births and deaths and weddings and every Easter morning for as long as anyone could remember. She could see the bell chamber through the windows, dark and mysterious, and she imagined the bells hanging there in the shadows, massive and silent, waiting for the ropes to be pulled, for the moment when they would wake and sing out across the village. The church sat at the edge of the square, surrounded by a low stone wall that enclosed both the building and a small graveyard where headstones stood in uneven rows, some leaning, some upright, all of them softened by moss and lichen and the simple passage of time. The wall was made of the same stone as the church, fitted together without mortar in some places, and it had a wooden gate set into it, a gate that had been repaired and replaced many times over the years, but that still hung in the same spot, still opened onto the same path. She walked toward the church, passing through the wooden gate and the wall, feeling it swing on its hinges with a familiar creak, a sound she had heard so many times that it was part of her internal map of the village, one of the sounds that said church to her as clearly as any words could. The gate was made of oak, gray with age, and its surface was rough and splintered in places, but it was still solid, still functional, and she appreciated that quality, the way things that were well made could endure, could continue serving their purpose long after their makers had passed on. She followed a narrow path that led between the graves, a path of worn earth bordered by grass that needed cutting, grass that was dotted with small white flowers she could not name. The graves themselves were marked by headstones of various types and sizes, some elaborate and carved with angels and crosses and scrolling vines, others simple and plain, bearing only a name and 2 dates. Some were recent, their stones still sharp-edged and clean, the inscriptions easy to read, while others were so old that their surfaces had eroded, the letters worn away by centuries of weather, becoming illegible, anonymous. She knew many of the names carved into the stones, people she had known in life, people who had been part of the village, part of the fabric of this place. There was old Thomas, who had kept the smithy and who had mended her mother's kettle more times than she could count. There was Sarah, who had sung in the church choir and who had grown the most beautiful roses in her garden. There was young William, who had died too soon, barely past childhood, and whose loss had cast a shadow over the village for a long time. All of these people were here now, their bodies returned to the earth, their stories concluded and yet not concluded, because they lived on in memory, in the stories that were told about them, in the ways they had shaped the lives of those who came after. She paused at one grave, a simple stone with a single name and 2 dates, and she stood there for a moment in silence, not thinking anything in particular, just being present, acknowledging the memory, the passage of time, the continuity of life and death and life again. This was someone she had loved, someone whose absence had once been a sharp pain, but had over time softened into something more like an ache, and then into something even gentler, a kind of tender awareness that was not quite sadness, but not quite anything else either. She did not speak, did not pray in any formal sense, but simply stood, and in that standing there was a kind of communion, a recognition that love does not end with death, but transforms, becomes something that can be carried rather than something that carries you. The graveyard was peaceful, she thought, not grim or frightening as graveyards sometimes seemed to be in stories, but rather restful, a place of quiet dignity. The stones stood like silent guardians, marking the boundaries between past and present, between life and death, and yet suggesting that these boundaries were perhaps not as firm as they seemed, that there was a continuity that ran through everything, connecting all times and all lives into a single tapestry. The grass grew green between the graves, and small birds hopped among the stones, pecking at insects, singing their songs, and life continued here, as it continued everywhere, heedless and persistent. The path led to the church door, a heavy wooden door set in a stone arch, and she pushed it open, the hinges creaking softly in a way that seemed loud in the quiet of the morning, and stepped inside. The interior of the church was cool and dim, the thick walls keeping out the warmth of the rising sun, creating a space that felt separate from the outside world, removed from time in some essential way. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust to the lower light, and she stood just inside the doorway, blinking, waiting for the shapes around her to resolve into clarity. The space was simple, as befitted a village church, with rows of wooden pews leading toward an altar at the far end, and high windows that let in beams of dusty light that fell across the stone floor in pale rectangles. The windows were plain glass, not stained, but their height and narrowness gave them a quality that was almost sacred, as though they were openings not just to the outside world, but to something beyond it. The light that came through them was soft and diffused, filled with floating motes of dust that drifted lazily in the still air, making visible the invisible movements of air currents. The pews were old, made of dark oak that had been polished smooth by generations of use, by the countless people who had sat in them over the years. Each pew bore the marks of its history, scratches and dents in worn spots where hands had gripped the wood, where knees had rested against it during prayers. Some of the pews had small brass plaques attached to them, memorials to families or individuals who had supported the church, and these plaques caught what little light there was, gleaming dully in the shadows. The floor was made of large stone slabs, irregular in size and shape, fitted together like puzzle pieces, their surfaces worn smooth in the aisles where people walked, but still rough and textured elsewhere. The stones were gray, but not uniformly so, some darker, some lighter, some with veins of other colors running through them, white and pink and a pale green that might have been lichen or might have been some quality of the stone itself. In places the floor was marked with brass tablets set into the stone, markers for graves that lay beneath, for people who had been buried inside the church in ages past, when such things were still done. The ceiling was high and vaulted, crossed with dark wooden beams that supported the weight of the roof and the tower above. The beams were massive, hand-hewn from trees that must have been enormous, and they bore the marks of the tools that had shaped them, the broad cuts of axes and adzes. They were beautiful in their simple functionality, in the way they did their work without ornamentation or pretense, and she found herself looking up at them with admiration, thinking about the skill and labor that had gone into their making, the planning and effort required to raise them into place. The walls were stone, like the exterior, but here they were plastered and whitewashed, creating smooth surfaces that reflected what little light there was, making the space brighter than it would otherwise have been. On the walls hung simple wooden crosses, and a few paintings, old and darkened with age, depicting scenes from Scripture in styles that were naive and direct. There were no elaborate decorations, no gold or jewels or expensive furnishings, only the simple necessities of worship, and this simplicity felt right to her, felt honest and true. A few candles flickered near the altar, their flames small and steady, and the scent of beeswax filled the air, mingling with the smell of old stone and wood, and the faint mustiness that comes from a building that has stood for a very long time. The candles were the only source of light at the front of the church, and they cast a warm glow on the altar, which was covered with a white cloth embroidered with simple patterns of crosses and vines. Behind the altar hung a large wooden cross, plain and unadorned, and it stood out against the white wall like a dark declaration, both stark and comforting in its simplicity. She walked slowly down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing softly in the quiet space, each step producing a small sound that traveled up to the vaulted ceiling and came back changed, softer, as though the building itself were absorbing the sound and returning it gentler. She chose a pew near the middle of the church, one of the worn wooden benches that had been polished smooth by the countless people who had sat there before her, and she settled into it, feeling the hard wood beneath her, the coolness of it through her skirt. She sat for a moment, adjusting her position, and then she folded her hands loosely in her lap, feeling the smooth wood beneath her, the coolness of the stone floor beneath her feet, the weight of her shawl on her shoulders. She did not pray, not in any formal sense, not with words or specific requests, but she sat in a state of quiet attention, her mind open and still, receptive to the peace of the space, to the silence that seemed to hold and support her. It was a different kind of silence than the silence of the cottage or the silence of the morning lane, deeper somehow, more intentional, as though it had been cultivated and protected over centuries. The light from the candles wavered slightly, making small patterns of shadow and brightness on the walls, and she watched them without really watching, her gaze soft and unfocused, not fixing on anything in particular, but taking in the whole scene at once. She could see the altar, the cross, the simple furnishings, the rows of empty pews, stretching out on either side of her, all of it bathed in the gentle golden light of the candles and the pale gray light from the high windows. Everything was still, everything was quiet, and she felt herself settling into that stillness, becoming part of it. She breathed in the scent of beeswax and old stone, and she let the silence settle around her like a familiar shawl, comfortable and reassuring. It wrapped her gently, this silence, holding her without constraining her, offering her a space in which she could simply be without need or want or concern. She felt her breathing slow, felt the tension in her shoulders ease, felt her mind grow quiet and clear, like a pond after the wind has stopped blowing and the surface has become smooth again. Time seemed to slow even further here, or perhaps it was simply that she became less aware of it, less concerned with its passage. There was only the present moment, the feeling of sitting in this pew, the coolness of the air, the distant sound of a bird outside, the faint creak of the building itself as it stood against the gentle pressure of the morning breeze. She had no idea how long she sat like this, and it did not matter. Time, in this space felt less like a river flowing in one direction and more like a vast ocean, deep and still, without beginning or end. Other people began to arrive, entering the church quietly, taking their places in the pews, and she was aware of them in a peripheral way, hearing the soft shuffle of feet, the rustle of clothing, the occasional whispered greeting. But she remained focused inward, maintaining her own quiet space even as the church gradually filled with others. They were all here for the same reason, drawn by the same gentle pull of tradition, of Easter morning, of the desire to mark this day in a way that felt right and necessary. The bells began to ring, a sudden sound that filled the air, resonating through the stone walls, vibrating in the floor, in the pews, in her chest. But even the bells, though loud, did not feel jarring or urgent. They rang with a steady rhythm, a pattern that was familiar and expected, and she listened to them as she had listened to them every Easter for as long as she could remember, feeling then as a kind of announcement, a declaration that the day had truly begun. When the bells stopped, the silence that followed seemed even deeper, even more profound, and in that silence a figure moved to the front of the church, an elderly man in simple robes, the village priest, and he stood before the altar and began to speak in a low, gentle voice. His words were familiar, the same words that were spoken every year, speaking of renewal and hope and the turning of the seasons, and she listened, though not to the specific words so much as to the sound of his voice, the rhythm of his speech, the way it rose and fell like a kind of music. The service unfolded slowly, with prayers and hymns, and she joined in when it felt right, her voice blending with the others, a soft murmur of sound that rose toward the high ceiling and seemed to be absorbed by the stones themselves. There was no performance in it, no striving for beauty or correctness, only a collective participation in something that had been done in this place for generations, a continuity that connected her to all those who had come before and all those who would come after. When the service ended, people began to leave, filing out slowly, pausing to speak to one another in hushed voices, exchanging Easter greetings, touching hands, sharing quiet smiles. She remained seated for a while longer, in no hurry to join the departure, content to sit in the emptying church and feel the peace that lingered in the air. Eventually she rose, her knees stiff from sitting, and she made her way back down the aisle, out through the heavy door, and into the square beyond. The sun was higher now, well above the hills, and the light was brighter, warmer, no longer pale, but filled with the full strength of morning. The square was more lively than it had been earlier, with people gathered in small groups, children running between them, their voices light and happy, and she walked among them, acknowledging greetings, pausing occasionally to exchange a few words, but mostly just moving through, a part of the gathering, and yet separate, maintaining her own quiet space. She walked past the old oak tree, past the stone bench where she had paused earlier, and she continued along the lane that would take her back to her cottage. The gardens she passed now seemed more alive, the flowers more open, responding to the warmth of the sun, and she noticed details she had not seen before, the particular shape of a leaf, the way light fell across a stone wall, the shadow of a bird passing overhead. The village felt different now, more awake, more present, and yet still peaceful, still maintaining that gentle rhythm that seemed to define this place. People were going about their day, but slowly, without haste, carrying water, tending gardens, sweeping doorsteps, all the small tasks that made up the fabric of daily life. She passed the well where the man had been drawing water, but he was gone now, the bucket sitting on the stone rim, drops of water glistening in the sunlight. She returned to her own lane, to her own cottage, and she opened the door and stepped inside, back into the familiar space. The candle on the table had burned down considerably, the flame smaller now, and the fire in the hearth had settled into glowing coals. She moved to the window and opened it wide, letting in the spring air, fresh and clean, carrying with it the sounds of the village, distant voices, the creak of a cart, the laughter of children. She stood by the window for a long time, looking out at the lane, at the play of light and shadow on the cobblestones, at the gentle movement of leaves in the breeze. She felt a deep contentment, a sense of being exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, which was simply to be present, to witness this day, this Easter morning, in all its quiet beauty. Eventually she moved away from the window and went to the hearth, adding a few pieces of wood to the coals, watching as they caught and began to burn. She filled the kettle again and hung it over the fire, and when the water was hot, she made more tea, the same gentle blend as before, and she poured it into her cup and carried it to the table. She sat down, wrapping her hands around the warm cup, and she sipped slowly, tasting the familiar flavor, feeling the warmth spread through her. The afternoon stretched ahead, unmarked by any particular plan or obligation, and she was content with that, content to let the hours unfold in their own way. She might read for a while, or she might sit by the window and sew, or she might simply sit and watch the light change as the sun moved across the sky. It did not matter. What mattered was the quality of the time, the way she inhabited each moment, the attention she brought to the smallest details. She thought about the morning, about the walk to the church, the service, the faces of her neighbors, the sound of the bells, and she felt grateful for all of it, for the simple continuity of tradition, for the way the village came together to mark this day. There was comfort in that repetition, in the knowing that next year would bring another Easter morning, another walk to the church, another gathering of the community, and that she would be part of it as long as she was able. The tea grew cool in her cup, and she drank the last of it, setting the cup aside, and then she simply sat, her hands folded in her lap, looking around the cottage, at the simple furnishings, the familiar objects, the way the light fell across the floor. Everything was exactly as it should be, exactly as it had been, and yet somehow it all felt new, touched by the particular quality of this day, this Easter morning. She rose eventually and moved to the window again, leaning on the sill, looking out at the lane. A neighbor passed by, an older woman carrying a basket, and they exchanged a wave, a smile, and the woman continued on her way. A cat appeared, the same one she had seen earlier, or perhaps a different one, it was hard to say, and it walked along the wall opposite her cottage, balancing carefully, its tail held high. The sun was beginning its slow descent now, though it was still high, still filling the village with light. The shadows were starting to lengthen, just slightly, a hint of the afternoon to come. She watched the way the light changed, the way it seemed to soften as the day progressed, becoming less insistent, more gentle, and she appreciated that quality, the way the day seemed to be settling into itself, finding its own rhythm. She thought about preparing something to eat, something simple, perhaps bread and cheese, a few early greens from the garden, and she moved to the kitchen to gather what she needed. She worked slowly, taking her time, cutting the bread into thick slices, arranging them on a plate with the cheese, washing the greens in a bowl of water, drying them carefully. She set these things on the table, along with a jar of preserves she had made the previous autumn, and she sat down to eat, alone but not lonely, comfortable, in her own company. The bread was good, dense, and satisfying, and the cheese had a mild, creamy flavor that paired well with it. She spread a little of the preserve on a slice of bread, tasting the sweetness of the fruit, remembering the day she had made it, the kitchen filled with steam and the scent of cooking berries. Everything had its own history, its own story, and she was connected to all of it, part of the ongoing narrative of this place, this life. When she had finished eating, she cleared the table, washing the plate and knife, setting them on the shelf to dry, and then she moved to a chair by the window, a comfortable chair with a cushion that had been shaped by years of use. She settled into it, pulling a shawl around her shoulders, and she simply sat, looking out at the lane, at the village, at the afternoon, unfolding in its slow, gentle way. Time passed, though she did not measure it. The sun moved across the sky, the light shifted, the shadows grew longer, and she watched it all with a quiet attention, noticing the small changes, the way the color of the sky deepened, the way the air grew cooler as the afternoon progressed. She saw people passing by, going about their business, and each one was a small point of connection, a reminder that she was part of something larger, a community, a web of relationships that had been woven over time. A child ran past, laughing, chased by a dog, and she smiled at the sight, at the simple joy of it. An older couple walked by, arm in arm, moving slowly, and she watched them until they turned a corner and disappeared from view. The lane was never empty for long, but neither was it crowded, and there was a pleasant balance to it, a rhythm that felt right. She thought about getting up, about doing something, but there was no urgency to the thought, and she remained seated, content to simply be. Her mind wandered, moving from one thought to another without direction or purpose, thinking about the past, about people she had known, about seasons that had come and gone, about the way life moved in cycles, always returning, always renewing. The light continued to change, becoming softer, warmer, taking on the golden quality of late afternoon. The sun was lower now, and its rays came in at a sharp angle, illuminating the room in a way that was different from the morning light, richer and deeper. She watched the light move slowly across the floor, a bright patch that shifted inch by inch, and she found something deeply satisfying in that slow movement, in the evidence of time passing in such a visible way. She heard the church bells ring again, marking the hour, though she did not count the chimes. It did not matter what time it was. What mattered was the quality of the moment, the way she felt sitting in her chair by the window, wrapped in her shawl, watching the afternoon light, feeling the peace of the day settle around her. Eventually she rose and moved to the hearth, adding more wood to the fire, building it up so that it would burn through the evening. The flames grew, crackling and popping, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and she stood watching them for a while, feeling their warmth on her face and hands. Fire was a comfort, a necessity, and she appreciated it in a way that went beyond simple gratitude, a deep recognition of its importance, its role in making life possible. She filled the kettle again and set it over the fire, and when the water was hot, she made more tea, a different blend this time, something with a bit of mint and a hint of lemon balm, and she carried the cup back to her chair by the window. The tea was hot and fragrant, and she sipped it slowly, feeling it warm her from the inside, a gentle heat that spread through her chest and belly. The lane outside was quieter now, fewer people passing, and the light was fading, the sun sinking toward the hills, the sky beginning to take on the softer colors of evening. She watched as the blue deepened, as hints of pink and orange appeared near the horizon, subtle and delicate, and she felt herself slowing even further, matching her own rhythm to the rhythm of the day's ending. She thought about lighting the candle on the table, but not yet, not quite yet. There was still enough light to see by, still enough brightness in the sky. She would wait until the moment felt right, until the darkness had advanced just far enough that the candle would be needed, would be welcomed. The birds that had been singing throughout the day began to quiet, their songs tapering off, becoming less frequent, and in their place came the softer sounds of evening, the rustle of leaves, the distant lowing of a cow, the creak of a door. The village was settling down, preparing for the night, and she was settling down with it, allowing herself to be carried along by the natural progression of the day. She finished her tea and set the cup aside, and she simply sat, her hands folded in her lap, watching the light fade. There was something profound in this daily transition, in the way the world moved from light to darkness, from activity to rest, and she felt privileged to witness it, to be present for it, to allow it to happen around her and within her. The light was almost gone now, the sky a deep blue, the first stars beginning to appear, faint and tentative. She rose and went to the table, taking up the candle that had been burning since morning, now burned down to a stub, and she used it to light a fresh candle, transferring the flame from one to the other. The new candle caught, the flame growing steady, and she placed it in the holder on the table, where it cast a warm circle of light. She moved through the cottage, closing the windows, drawing the curtains, shutting out the night. The fire in the hearth was burning well, and the cottage felt warm and secure, a safe haven against the darkness outside. She prepared a simple evening meal, heating some soup she had made earlier in the week, slicing more bread, and she ate slowly, sitting at the table in the candlelight, tasting each spoonful, each bite, giving her full attention to the simple act of nourishing herself. When she had finished, she washed the bowl and spoon, tidied the kitchen, and then she returned to her chair by the hearth, not by the window now, but by the fire, where she could feel its warmth more directly. She wrapped herself in a blanket and sat watching the flames, the way they moved and shifted, the patterns they made, the sounds they produced, the soft crackling and occasional pop. Her mind was quiet now, emptied of thoughts, or perhaps more accurately, filled with a kind of thoughtless awareness, a state of being that required no words, no analysis, no planning. She simply was, sitting in her chair, watching the fire, feeling the warmth, hearing the sounds of the cottage settling around her, the small creaks and sighs of a building at rest. Time passed, unmeasured and unimportant. The fire burned down, and she added more wood, watching as the flames caught, flared up, then settled into a steady burn. The candle on the table burned lower, the pool of wax growing larger, and she watched that, too, the way the flame trembled slightly, casting moving shadows. She thought about going to bed, but there was no hurry. She was comfortable where she was, warm and content, and she allowed herself to simply sit, to be present in this moment, this quiet end to Easter Day. She thought about the morning, about the walk to the church, about the service, about the return home, and it all seemed part of a single, continuous experience, a flowing movement from one moment to the next. The village outside was silent now, or nearly so. Occasionally she heard a distant sound, a door closing, a voice calling, but these were rare, and they only emphasized the depth of the quiet that surrounded them. Everyone was in their own homes now, in their own spaces, settling down for the night, and she felt connected to them all, even in this solitude, knowing that they were all part of the same rhythm, the same daily cycle of waking and sleeping, of light and darkness. She allowed her eyes to close for a moment, not sleeping but resting, and when she opened them again, the fire seemed to have burned down a bit more, the flames lower, the light softer. She considered adding more wood, but instead she decided to let it burn down, to allow the fire to settle into coals that would glow through the night, providing a gentle warmth. She rose from her chair, slowly, feeling the stiffness in her joints, and she moved through the cottage one last time, checking that everything was in its place, that the door was securely fastened, that the candle on the table was safe. Then she went to her bedroom, where the bed waited with its quilts and pillows, and she undressed slowly, putting on a nightgown, and she slipped between the sheets, feeling their coolness against her skin, a coolness that would soon warm from her own body heat. She lay on her back, looking up at the ceiling, barely visible in the darkness, and she listened to the sounds of the night, the very faint sounds, the settling of the cottage, the distant hoot of an owl, the whisper of wind in the eaves. She felt herself relaxing, her body sinking into the mattress, her breathing slowing, becoming deeper, more regular. She thought about the day, about Easter morning, about the quiet celebration, about the walk through the village, about the service in the church, about the afternoon spent sitting by the window, watching the light change. It had been a good day, a peaceful day, a day marked not by grand events or dramatic moments, but by the gentle accumulation of small, quiet experiences, each one simple and unremarkable on its own, but together forming something meaningful, something that felt complete. She felt grateful for the day, for the village, for the cottage, for the simple rhythms of her life. She felt grateful for the morning light and the evening darkness, for the warmth of the fire and the coolness of the sheets, for the taste of tea and bread, for the sound of the church bells and the sight of early flowers. All of it was gift, all of it was enough. Her thoughts began to drift, becoming less coherent, less focused, and she did not try to hold on to them. She allowed them to come and go like clouds moving across the sky, present for a moment and then dissolving. She felt herself moving toward sleep, toward that threshold between waking and dreaming, and she went willingly, without resistance. The darkness was complete now, the cottage silent, the village silent, the whole world seeming to hold its breath in the quiet of the night. She lay still, her breathing slow and steady, her body relaxed, her mind at rest. Somewhere in the distance the owl called again, a soft sound that seemed to come from very far away, and then there was only silence, deep and profound. She felt herself letting go, releasing the day, releasing all thought, all awareness, sinking deeper into rest, into the softness of the bed, into the warmth that surrounded her. There was nothing more to do, nowhere to go, nothing to think about. There was only this moment, this gentle fading, this quiet transition from waking to sleep. The night held her, cradled her, and she surrendered to it completely, allowing it to carry her into dreams, into rest, into the deep peace that comes at the end of a day well lived. Easter morning had come and gone, marked and celebrated, and now it was time to rest, to sleep, to let the world turn without her attention, knowing that morning would come again, as it always did, with its soft light and gentle rhythms. And so she slept deeply and peacefully, her breathing barely audible in the silent cottage, her body still and relaxed, her mind quiet and empty. The fire in the hearth burned down to glowing coals. The candle on the table guttered and went out, and the darkness was complete, a darkness that was not frightening or oppressive, but comforting and safe, a darkness that promised rest and renewal. The village slept around her, all the cottages dark, all the lanes empty, and the night stretched on, peaceful and undisturbed, holding everything in its quiet embrace. The hills stood silent under the stars, the church rose dark against the sky, and in the gardens the early flowers closed their petals, waiting for the morning to come again. Time moved forward, as it always does, but in the sleeping village time seemed to lose its urgency, its insistence, and there was only the present moment, stretching out endlessly, a moment of rest and peace and quiet contentment. The woman slept on, dreaming perhaps of morning light, of walks through village lanes, of the sound of bells and the scent of flowers, or perhaps not dreaming at all, simply resting in the deep restorative sleep that comes at the end of a gentle day. The night held her, held the village, held the world, and all was well, all was peaceful, all was exactly as it should be. And in that peace, in that quiet, in that darkness, there was a kind of perfection, a completeness that required nothing more, nothing added, nothing taken away, only the simple presence of rest, of sleep, of the night doing what night does, holding the world until morning comes again.